Neurodiversity 1.0 and Other Critiques of the Mainstream Understanding of Neurodiversity, Part 1. Introduction. A few years earlier, Judy Singer had been given a thought-provoking assignment by her rabbi to develop a version of the Ten Commandments that were better than God's. The occasion was the annual commemoration of the giving of the Torah to Moses and the Jewish people on Mount Sinai, Shavuot. Singer, who considers herself culturally Jewish but is not a fan of organized religion, says that she was a bit hesitant to accept the rabbi's challenge because she feared that it would be rigged in favor of omniscience. But she marshaled enough chutzpah to come up with the first commandment that reflected her commitment to the health of the environment. Honor diversity, lest thou endeth up like unto the cactus of the desert. Steve Silberman, Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. This series of videos for me has been a long time coming. To give a bit of context, in February 2020, just about 2 weeks before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, I started realizing that I was autistic. It wasn't a particularly surprising or difficult to accept realization. In a sense, I had always known this about myself, even if I didn't have the exact words to give meaning to it all. However, it was definitely a welcome moment of clarity that helped me put myself into better context for myself. Learning about being autistic quickly led me to learning about neurodiversity, which is what, for better or worse, sparked my desire to make these videos. Particularly because, as the title suggests, so many people, including and often, especially the most notable, autistic and neurodivergent. Let's put a pin in that, and apologies in advance because this is a phrase I'll be repeating many times throughout this, and I do promise to get back to every single one of them in this and or every subsequent video. Neurodivergent voices within the mainstream neurodiversity movement misunderstand and don't seem interested in developing a more nuanced, informed understanding of neurodiversity. And my frustration with that, more than anything, is foundational to why I feel compelled to do this. I also believe that because of how much white autistic, neurodivergent, and neurotypical, put a pin in that word too, voices have historically dominated and continue to dominate and define both online and in-person discourse about neurodiversity and what it means to be autistic in both the West and globally. I think it's important that I, as a queer Black autistic person, albeit from the West, try to shift the conversation and some definitions in a direction that is more inclusive and true to the liberatory intentions of both the autistic self-advocacy movement and the neurodiversity movement. My other goal with these videos, besides trying to correct the misinformation out there, is to hopefully thread the needle in order to put neurodiversity into better context, especially as it relates to psychology and psychiatry, so people have a better jumping off point when they start to dip their toes or take another dive into neurodiversity. I should also note that this is not some high-minded, I know better than you, so you should listen to me kind of essay. A lot of this is born out of my own journey of learning about and developing a nuanced understanding of neurodiversity, with many missteps in my own understanding. Before we begin, for this video and at the beginning of every subsequent video, I'll start by listing the works that I'll be referencing throughout, and I'll leave a link to a Google Drive file that will have all these works available in PDF formats, as well as a doc that lists all the websites that I'll be referring to. So for those who are inclined, you can read them for yourselves, which I recommend if you have the time and are interested in learning more about neurodiversity and such on your own, but it's not a requirement for this video. So the works are Neurodiversity on the Neurological Underpinnings of Geekdom by Harvey Bloom for The Atlantic, Judy Singer's 1998 thesis, Odd People In, The Birth of Community Amongst People on the Autistic Spectrum, a personal exploration of a new social movement based on neurological diversity, Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity by Steve Silberman, Neurodiversity, The Birth of an Idea by Judy Singer, Judy Singer's blog titled Reflections on Neurodiversity, Neuroqueer Heresies, Notes on Neurodiversity Paradigm, Autistic Empowerment, and Postnormal Possibilities by Dr. Nick Walker, PhD. Unmasking Autism, Discovering the New Faces of Neurodiversity by Dr. Devin Price, PhD. A Talk to Teachers by James Baldwin. Towards a Neuroqueer Future, an interview with Nick Walker by Dr. Dora M. Raymaker, PhD. To Siri with Love and the Problem with Neurodiversity, Light by Shane M. Neumeyer. Neurodiversity, The Basics by David Gray Hammond for emergentdivergence.com. And What Does Neurotypical Even Mean by Critical Neurodiversity. Also, because I'm reading the PDF versions of books, papers, etc., all of them don't have page numbers, so some of the citations I make may be wrong if you're reading the physical copies of them. So I apologize for that in advance. With that said, let's start at the beginning. Neurodiversity Part 1, aka, anyway, what does neurodiversity even mean? The word neurodiversity first appeared in the public consciousness in 1998 when Harvey Bloom wrote in an article titled Neurodiversity on the Neurological Underpinnings of Geekdom for The Atlantic about John Katz's assertion of the social and political ramifications of geekdom. The website isn't the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical, a parody of the many institutes and journals devoted to the study of autism, and how it gave geeks space to emerge from the neurological closet and declare themselves to be autistic. In the article, Bloom says neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment? Cybernetics and computer culture, for example, may favor a somewhat autistic cast of mind. That would lend neurological significance to John Katz's foregrounding of geek force, and would make Isn's argument for neurodiversity not only timely, but quite possibly irresistible. Also in 1998, Judy Singer, the Australian sociologist and notable transphobe who's credited for coining neurodiversity, put a pin in this, wrote a thesis titled Odd People In: The Birth of Community Amongst People on the Autistic Spectrum, a personal exploration of a new social movement based on neurological diversity at the University of Technology, Sydney in 1998. Her thesis is a meditation on neurodiversity, autistic self-advocacy, the role technology plays in autistic self-advocacy, being the second of three generations of women on the spectrum, put a pin in that phrase, in her family, and neurodiversity within the context of other socio-political movements, namely feminism and disability rights, and postmodernism. In Odd People In, Singer says, "For me, the significance of the autistic spectrum lies in its call for and anticipation of a politics of neurodiversity. The neurologically different represent a new addition to the familiar political categories of class, gender, race, and will augment the insights of the social model of disability." Put a pin in that term for later. The rise of neurodiversity takes postmodernism fragmentation one step further. Just as the postmodern era sees every once too solid belief melt into air, even our most taken for granted assumptions that we all more or less see, feel, touch, hear, smell, and sort information in more or less the same way, unless visibly disabled, are being dissolved. She goes on to argue, why not propose that just as biodiversity is essential for ecosystem stability, neurodiversity may too be essential to cultural stability? Why not strategically argue that the nurturing of neurodiversity gives society a repository of types who may come into their own under unforeseeable circumstances? This is something that can't be argued against. Anyone who lives in the world understands that no two people think, experience their senses, and engage with the world writ large in exactly the same way, even if they were raised in the same household, in the same community, by the same parents and caregivers and such, and have the same friends. Neurodiversity is a fact of life that we, as a society, implicitly recognize as a fundamental truth. See the understanding that if two people listen to the same song, there's no guarantee that just because one of them liked it, that the other will. People's varying opinions on which apples are the best, and people's opinions on film and television, while explicitly acting as though it is non-existent and simultaneously treating it with contempt. See transphobia, acephobia, queerphobia, anti-autistic discrimination, etc. Explicitly understanding and openly and critically engaging with neurodiversity as a social and political fact with which society must also orient itself around for the betterment of all people is something that must happen if we are to ever truly make the world a better place. In his 2015 book, Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity, which is a fascinating book on the history of autism from clinical environments to public consciousness that highlights the fact that autistic people have always been a natural part of humanity, even prior to our pathologization, explores the rise and necessity of the autistic self-advocacy movement and the neurodiversity movement, and how the anti-vax movement, Autism Speaks, and the larger anti-autistic movement and the movie Rain Man became fundamentally intertwined. Steve Silberman adds, though the spectrum model of autism and the concept of neurodiversity are widely believed to be products of our postmodern world, they turn out to be very old ideas, proposed by Hans Asperger in his first public lecture on autism in 1938. The idea of neurodiversity has inspired the creation of a rapidly growing civil rights movement based on the simple idea that the most astute interpreters of autistic behavior are autistic people themselves rather than their parents or doctors. He goes on to say, one way to understand neurodiversity is to think in terms of human operating systems instead of diagnostic labels like dyslexia and ADHD. The brain is, above all, a marvelously adaptive organism, adept at maximizing its chances of success even in the face of daunting limitations. Just because a computer is not running Windows doesn't mean that it's broken, which again is a basic fact that, for reasons I'll get into more in later videos, we as a society know and understand in theory while rejecting it in practice. It should never have been a struggle in society to accept the fact that no two people think, act, feel, smell, etc. the same way, despite, for all intents and purposes, having the same hardwire, a brain, a heart, lungs, kidneys, bladder, etc. We experience the fact of neurodiversity every day when we engage with another person. Yet it's somehow difficult to accept this as a naturally occurring human fact rather than a result of a disorder or a condition. In her 2016 book, Neurodiversity, The Birth of an Idea, Singer goes on to say, this word neurodiversity didn't come out of the blue, but was the culmination of my academic research and a lifetime of personal experiences of exclusion and invalidation as a person struggling in a family affected by a quote-unquote hidden disability that neither we nor society recognized for what it was. On her blog, Reflections on Neurodiversity, Singer continues, neurodiversity, noun, a biological truism that refers to the limitless variability of human nervous systems on the planet, in which no two can ever be exactly alike due to the influence of environmental factors. Usage encompasses all humanity, is an advocacy term to name the neurodiversity movement, a civil rights movement for psychomedically labeled minorities and their allies, is a category of the intersectional factors that define advantage or disadvantage that misusage does not mean neurological disability or otherness, is not a diagnosis, is not a descriptor of genomes. Literally, the term refers to all beings with the nervous system, but since I coined it for a human rights advocacy purpose, I limited it to Homo sapiens. The term biodiversity covers the rest. Is neurodiversity a scientific term? No, it's a political term. Some critics of the neurodiversity movement like to scoff that neurodiversity is not a scientific term. It should be clear from the above that it was never intended to be. It simply names an indisputable fact about our planet that no two human minds are exactly alike and uses it to name a paradigm for social change. And this is important to understand and commit to memory because now we will get into what neurodiversity is not. Neurodiversity Part 2, aka Have We Sold the Cause for the Queen? In a 2020 interview for Autism in Adulthood with Dr. Dora M. Raymaker, PhD, Dr. Nick Walker, PhD, a professor of psychology and prominent queer voice in the neurodiversity movement, says, the growing popularity of the term neurodiversity has led to its widespread appropriation as a buzzword by a lot of individuals and organizations who don't understand its implications and are still very much thinking and operating within the pathology paradigm. I came across this interview in either late 2021 or early 2022 during the early days of my learning about neurodiversity, and has stuck with me ever since because it perfectly captures everything I've noticed about how neurodiversity is discussed online and offline since 2021. Last year on a news broadcast, I heard one of the anchors use the word neurodiversive, put a pin in that, and I was like, the mainstream discourse around neurodiversity is cooked. And this is in large part due to the fact that even most of the prominent voices within the neurodiversity movement and on the subject of neurodiversity misunderstand the aims of the movement they either represent or are seen as representing, and the concept they are looked at as being authorities on, even considering how much it's repeated that the neurodiversity movement has no leader. Now, I will say up front that I don't see myself as or believe myself to be an authoritative voice on the subject or the movement, nor do I see myself as an activist. I see myself as a reluctant educator who's committed to their own education and that of those with whom I share a community. And to quote James Baldwin, the paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. The purpose of education, finally, is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself, this is black or this is white, to decide for himself whether there is a God in heaven or not. To ask questions of the universe and then learn to live with those questions is a way he achieves his own identity. But no society is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What societies really ideally want is a citizenry which will simply obey the rules of society. If a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. The obligation of anyone who thinks of himself as responsible is to examine society and try to change it and to fight it at no matter what the risk. This is the only hope society has. This is the only way societies change. More to the point though, in 2021, Dr. Nick Walker, PhD, released his book, Neuroqueer Heresies, Notes on the Neurodiversity Paradigm, Autistic Empowerment, and Post-Normal Possibilities, an extrapolation of essays he previously published on his website Neuroqueer, formerly known as Neurocosmopolitanism, one of which was featured in a 2012 anthology of works written for and by autistic people titled Loud Hands, Autistic People Speaking, which is, in my experience, a lot of people's introduction to neurodiversity. An assessment I don't think Walker would disagree with, given that he states, throw away the master's tools remains one of the most significant things I've written in terms of its long-term influence on the discourse. It's been widely cited in academic works and translated into Spanish, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Czech. The conceptions of the pathology paradigm and the neurodiversity paradigm, originally articulated in this piece, are now integral to the fields of neurodiversity studies and critical autism studies, fields which didn't exist yet when I wrote those things. So much can happen in the blink of a decade. In this essay, he says, neurodiversity is a natural variation in human neurocognitive function. It is not a perspective of belief or political movement. The neurodiversity paradigm, however, is a perspective that views neurodiversity as a valuable form of human diversity. It is not synonymous with the neurodiversity, and the neurodiversity movement is a social justice movement advocating for civil rights and inclusion for neurodivergent individuals. It is not a singular organization, nor does it have a leader. What Walker gets correct in this is that the neurodiversity movement is not a singular organization. It is a movement that, even though it was born out of the autistic self-advocacy movement during its infancy, encompasses people diagnosed with ADHD, bipolar, Tourette syndrome, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and other learning and development disabilities, aka neurominorities, which affect both autistic and allistic non-autistic people. What he gets wrong is everything else. As stated before, neurodiversity is a distinctly political term, even considering it states a biological fact, just like as Singer states on her blog, Biodiversity. It is a political term that names a biological fact. The term neurodiversity was created for the purposes of naming a new paradigm intended to be, in addition to intersectionality, at the heart of a new civil rights movement, aka the neurodiversity movement. Drawing an arbitrary delineation between neurodiversity, the neurodiversity paradigm, and the movement itself doesn't make much sense, especially when you argue that the concept that names the paradigm at the heart of a political movement is not political, even though the paradigm it names and the movement built on it are both political. All three are fundamentally intertwined. Neurodiversity is the paradigm, is the movement. There's quite literally no way of getting around that. And the misconception that you can make any distinctions between neurodiversity, the paradigm it names, and the movement based on it that separates neurodiversity from its politics is, in my opinion, key in how we get to the mainstream understanding of neurodiversity, otherwise known as neurodiversity light, as Sean M. Newmeyer states in their article To Siri with Love and the Problem with Neurodiversity Light on rewirenewsgroup.com, which also put a pin in this for later. It's also an interesting delineation to make because Walker goes on to say that neurodiversity itself is, of course, the most essential piece of this new vocabulary of neurodiversity. The essence of the entire paradigm, the understanding of neurological variation as a natural form of human diversity, subject to the same societal dynamics as other forms of diversity, is packed into that one word. How can the essence of the entire paradigm of a political paradigm not be political? It's like saying the word feminism isn't a political term, but feminist critique and the feminist movement are political. It simply doesn't make sense. Even the distinction he goes on to make, neurodiversity is the phenomenon of human neurological diversity, and the neurodiversity paradigm is the understanding of neurodiversity as a natural form of human diversity, subject to the same societal dynamics as other forms of diversity, doesn't actually justify saying that neurodiversity isn't political, but the neurodiversity paradigm is, because again, neurodiversity is a paradigm. Neurodiversity is a fact. Neurodiversity is fundamentally political. That's the only way that the neurodiversity paradigm can be political. Neurodiversity is not, cannot, and should not ever be understood to be apolitical or politically neutral. In Dr. Devin Price, PhD's 2022 book, Unmasking Autism, Discovering the New Faces of Neurodiversity, he does something interesting and different, yet equally misguided in how he approaches talking about neurodiversity. He doesn't explicitly define it at all. He talks about how exactly he was introduced to the term. Quote, people like Rabbi Ruchi Reagan, author of the blog Real Social Skills, and Amethyst Shaber, the creator of the Neuro Wonderful video series, taught me about neurodiversity. I came to recognize that many disabilities are created or worsened by social exclusion, and explicitly credits Judy Singer with coining the term. Quote, autism is just one source of neurodiversity in our world. The term neurodiverse refers to the wide spectrum of individuals whose thoughts, emotions, or behaviors have been stigmatized as unhealthy, abnormal, or dangerous. The term was coined in 1999 by sociologist Judy Singer. However, he never explicitly defines what it is and what it is not, and he misuses terminology, calling people neurodiverse. Quote, this book is for any person who is neurodiverse or suspects that they are neurodiverse and wants to attain new levels of self-acceptance. Neurodiversity is a wide umbrella including everyone from autistics to ADHDers to people with schizophrenia, brain injuries, or narcissistic personality disorder, and suggesting that neurodiversity can exist in a single individual. Quote, Rory is an ADHD and autism self-advocate and researcher living in New Zealand. Like so many of us, they've developed autism-friendly quote-unquote life hacks to make regular life manageable. These are compensation strategies in a sense, but their goal isn't to mask Rory's neurodiversity so much as to make life easier and more bearable in a way that I think also helps misguide people about what neurodiversity is and what the aims of the movement are, and lays with almost perfect precision the groundwork for the elite capture of neurodiversity in the form of neurodiversity light. To recap, because I know that was probably a lot of information. 1. Dr. Nick Walker, PhD's bifurcation of the term neurodiversity from its fundamental politics is demonstrably wrong. 2. Dr. Devin Price, PhD's avoiding grounding his intended audience with the concrete definition of neurodiversity is unhelpful to the movement. And 3. Both ideas combined contribute to why the efficacy of the neurodiversity movement is incredibly low and why people's understanding of neurodiversity is still rooted within the pathology paradigm. An attempt at pruning other variants or other critiques of the mainstream understanding of neurodiversity. To reiterate, though, 1. Neurodiversity is a political term. 2. Neurodiversity is a political term that names a biological truism in the same vein of biodiversity. 3. Neurodiversity is a political term that names a biological truism that names a paradigm. 4. Neurodiversity is a political term that names a biological truism that names a paradigm at the heart of a movement. And 5. Neurodiversity is a political term that names a biological truism that names a paradigm at the heart of a movement that is intended to abolish the ways neurominorities are pathologized by society for not being quote-unquote normal, and challenge the concept of normal to reveal that no such thing actually exists, because, as we all know, what's normal for one person or group is not necessarily normal for another person or group. Now, to be sure, I don't think Price, Walker, or a lot of people whose understanding of neurodiversity was shaped by the work they've done intentionally set out to warp the public perception of neurodiversity to nefarious ends. It's evident that they both, and so many others, are genuinely and earnestly invested in the good of neurodiversity, autistic self-advocacy, and the neurodiversity movement. Both of their books have great ideas that I'll come back to and reference in subsequent videos, and I'm not arguing that we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I just think that somewhere along the way, something about neurodiversity got lost in translation, a lot of which I think has to do with the fact that Judy Singer is an unabashed transphobe, and people want to distance themselves, neurodiversity, and the neurodiversity movement from her as much as they possibly can without abandoning her to the dustbins of history. And it hasn't helped the movement at all beyond introducing people to a concept whose core principles they feel no real allegiance to. Neurodiversity both means something very specific and absolutely nothing to a lot of people, as evidenced by the general state of neurodiversity discourse, which is still very much rooted and invested in the pathologizing of minorities in hopes that diversity, equity, and inclusion alone will solve the issues fundamental to psychology and psychiatry. Put a pin in this for later. I'm going to dedicate an entire video to this very topic. Another way to think about it, to quote Singer in her blog titled How Not to Define Neurodiversity, neurodiversity, like biodiversity, refers to the degree of variability of a specific variable in a specific location. In the case of neurodiversity, it refers to the entire human population of the location called Earth. Its usage, as I defined it, was simply to name a social movement for people who were misdiagnosed, misunderstood, and marginalized by categories invented by the psychomedical model, which aligned itself very much with the needs of the 20th century capitalist environment for a standardized, obedient workforce. My intent was to broaden the scope of disability, which included in 1990s only 3 categories: physical, intellectual, mental illness, which also included everything else that the medical profession didn't understand. Clearly, another category was needed. Neurodivergences is not mental illness, even though many of us may have been rendered mentally ill by punitive attempts to normalize us and by stigma, exclusion, ridicule, and discrimination. 2, to ensure that neurodiversity was always contextualized by what we now call intersectionality. Or simply, to quote Singer, neurodiversity is politics, not science. I'll get more into what the neurodiversity movement is about in a later video. However, this is a good introduction to understanding the information that will come later. Another way to understand what the neurodiversity movement is about as a one-on-one course type thing is, as Singer states in her blog titled Neurodivergent from What Exactly? The neurodiversity movement is, however, an identity politics vehicle for people who are discriminated against for differing from the culturally defined normal range. That said, let's turn our attention a bit to terminology that's used. First up are neurodivergent, neurotypical, and neurodivergence. The website emergentdivergence.com defines these terms as such in their article titled Neurodiversity, the Basics. What is neurodivergence? A neurodivergent person is an individual who cannot perform neurotypicality. The term was coined by Kashin Isumusu 2000. Sorry if I mispronounce her name. Some incorrectly believe it refers exclusively to those born with a neurological difference, such as autistic and ADHD people, but it reaches further. Neurodivergence also refers to those full spectrum of mental health conditions, as well as traumatic brain injury and epilepsy, to name a few. If your brain functions differently for any reasons, congratulations, you're neurodivergent. What is neurotypical? A neurotypical person is a person who can comfortably perform neuronormative standards of the predominant culture. As these standards change from culture to culture, it is generally considered that neurotypicality is more of a performance than a distinct neurotype itself. Some have incorrectly positioned neurotypicality and neurodivergence as binary opposites to each other. A better way of understanding neurotypicality is as those whose neurocognition affords them privilege within the predominant culture, with the understanding that no two brains are exactly the same. Important to note here, as per the article titled What Does Neurotypical Even Mean on criticalneurodiversity.com, although it may have emerged earlier, the word neurotypical is usually dated back to autistic advocate Laura Thesinik's website on the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical, ISN't, launched in 1998. The ISN't was a fictional institute whose spoof website was essentially used by autistic people to satirically reverse the psychiatric gaze back onto people considered normal. On this website, as the cynic recalls, a range of autistic writers picked apart characteristics of neurotypical individuals in the same patronizing, pathologizing voice in which traits commonly held by autistic people are described, with feigned obliviousness to how such traits might also be useful. Now, while I do understand why these terms had utility in the past, particularly during the nascent autistic self-advocacy and neurodiversity movements, I think that due to the changing socio-political landscape of both these movements and the wider world, we need to rethink the terms. In my opinion, I think that if it's understood that no two brains are exactly alike, neurotypical and neurodivergent become inefficient and ineffective ways to categorize people, because there's no such thing as a typical or normal brain. And we know that because we are not all simultaneously doctors, nurses, professors, psychologists, psychiatrists, musicians, computer programmers, lawyers, etc. There can't exactly be a neurotypical person or a neurodivergent person because, by definition, people are neurodivergent from each other, but no one is neurotypical in tandem with another person. For that reason, I think referring to a culture or a society as neurotypical makes more sense because neurotypical is a set of ideals and expectations that people are expected to aspire to and operate from, not really something someone can actually be and embody, try as they might. And because of that, it puts the term neurodivergent in a precarious position because by virtue of being neurodivergent technically encompasses all people because it, to me, more so refers to how our brains exist in relation to each other rather than something any single person or particular group in and of themselves can embody or be. I'm more of a proponent of categorizing people as either autistic or allistic, non-autistic, with the understanding that both autistic and allistic people fall short of the ideals and expectations created for and by allistic people of neurotypical culture and society. And in order to maintain the idea that allistic equals normal equals neurotypical, allistic people have created ways to draw arbitrary delineations between people that tries to definitively define what is and isn't normal via the pathology paradigm. Next up is the term neurodiverse. Singer defines it as such. Neurodiverse adjective describes a space, not a person. Preferably don't use it. Use neurodivergent, distinct, minority, etc. Neurodiverse is literally an unreal word in the same sense as an unreal number, since every location that has more than one individual in it is neurodiverse. However, since the word has been widely adopted as an identity and has no other usage, and people who identify thus find it useful, I reluctantly accept this usage. Misuse does not mean neurologically disabled. Probably one of a few disagreements I have with her is her acceptance of people calling themselves neurodiverse. The only other ones that I can think of is her acceptance of the usage and definition of neurodivergent, and the fact that she has gone out of her way to obfuscate the fact that she's transphobic, saying she's linguophilic, and that there have always been different types of feminists when rightly called a TERF. And the reason I keep bringing up the fact that she's transphobic is because if you remember at the start of this, there's a quote where her first commandment that was supposed to be better than God's commandment was to honor diversity. And it's very interesting to me that a white woman whose family nearly got wiped out because of white supremacy, who is living in a white supremacist colony, Australia, says that honoring diversity is important while also believing that honoring gender diversity is important. And gender diversity is something that existed long before white people started fucking around with the world. And it doesn't make sense to say that you honor diversity, but when it comes to something that is a fact of life, gender diversity, you think that that's not something that's worth honoring, and you think that it shouldn't exist, and you agree with people like J.K. Rowling who say that trans women aren't real women. Just doesn't make sense. It's like, this is something I'll get back to later on in terms of like how, like the issue that I have with like white autistic people being the main voices within the neurodiversity movement, but I'll leave that here for now. Anyway, Singer goes on to say, some advocates want to insist that an individual can be neurodiverse in themselves because they have different tendencies. This is also absurd unless they have more than one individual nervous system in their bodies, and also it would be a reversion to the medical model of disability. Caveats: if a member of the general public wishes to call themselves neurodiverse, they should not be corrected, but professionals and academics should get this right. I think that if professionals and academics need to get it right, so too should the general public, in order to make as little as possible the chance of people misinterpreting what neurodiverse means, so that we also make sure that everyone is on the same page about neurodiversity and the neurodiversity movement in aspects. I know this may all seem a bit pedantic, and it probably is, as autistic people are wont to be. However, I think considering how far off the beaten path people are in their understanding of neurodiversity and the neurodiversity movement, it's how we get people throwing around words like neurodiversive, despite the fact that that's not a thing, nor does it have a meaning, and represents a fundamental misunderstanding of neurodiversity as a whole. It's necessary to quote Samantha Stein in her video Autism in Girls, I was wrong. Actually scrap everything and start again from first principles, because a lot of people are getting things so wrong in the beginning of their critical understanding of critical engagement with and adopting the practice of neurodiversity and the neurodiversity movement. This is also something to put a pin for later. And so concludes part 1 of this video series. I am open to feedback and I welcome constructive conversations because, as with everyone, I'm still sharpening my understanding of neurodiversity and developing the ways in which I can better contribute towards the conversation and the movement. I have had ideas that I've abandoned once I accepted how misguided they were, and I have had to rethink my understanding of and relationship to neurodiversity, psychology, psychiatry, disability, etc., in order to learn to do and be better. So again, I'm not saying any of this from a high horse, nor am I saying this as an attack on anyone. I think we all should, can, and must do and be better if we want to make the lasting, necessary social, political, and economic changes to society for the betterment of everyone. To quote Shane M. Neumeyer, like most work towards social justice, advocacy that relies on the neurodiversity framework requires challenging basic assumptions and upending entire systems, including the ones that even many people in the broader autism advocacy world believe are inherently worthwhile. Also, as a mini recap, these are the pins that I pointed out in this video. 1, neurodivergent, which I addressed in this video. Neurotypical, which I also addressed. Who coined the term neurodiversity, which I'll save for a later video because I think that's like a very fascinating thing that deserves its own video. The phrase on the spectrum, which I think I'll address in the next video that I'll be making. The social model of disability, which will come probably 2 or 3 videos after the next one. The term neurodiversive, which I addressed in this video. Neurodiversity light, which I'll address towards the end when I talk about the neurodiversity movement as a whole. Critical psychiatry and critical psychology, which will come before when I talk about the social model of disability. And the neurodiversity movement, which again, I'll be talking about towards the end. I know that like it's probably or may be frustrating to some people that I didn't explicitly state or spell out every single thing that I talked about in this video. I just didn't think that it was important to do that right now. I think it's better to have the information available now so that way once I bring it up again, and I'll be recapping the videos before I start I should say I'll be recapping the prior videos before I start whatever new video, so that way everyone's working from the same understanding. But that's why I didn't hammer home every single point made in this, because this topic is very long and it connects too many threads, and I didn't initially want this video to be long, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be long anyway. So I decided that breaking it up into smaller parts to give it more space and to talk more in depth about certain things would be the better idea. So if you're going to stick with me for the rest of the videos, thank you. If not, hopefully this is helpful in any way, shape, or form for you. I'm going to provide the links to the Google Doc drive that I have that has all the resources that I reference in this video. I'll also post a link to my Patreon if you're inclined to support what I'm doing. That also has, and also in my bio, it has like links to my other social media accounts, which is mainly Blue Sky, because I don't really use anything else. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you share, like and subscribe, all that good stuff. See you in the next video. Thanks.